What happens when the U.S. government finally decides to fight back against terror? In the 1870s, midnight raids, federal arrests, and prison sentences shook America. This is the real story of the first federal crackdown on domestic terror groups. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the nation forever. The knock on the door came after midnight. It was loud, hard, angry. Inside the small wooden house in rural South Carolina, a man jumped from his bed. He had worn a white robe just hours earlier. He had ridden through the dark with a group of masked men. They had fired guns into the air. They had dragged a black school teacher from his home. They had warned him never to teach again. Now the hunters had become the hunted. "Open in the name of the United States government!" The man froze. This was not a local sheriff. This was not a neighbor. This was federal authority. Outside stood United States Marshals, backed by federal troops. They carried warrants signed in Washington. They had names, they had sworn statements, and they had orders to arrest members of the Ku Klux Klan. The door burst open. The man was pulled into the night in chains, and he was not alone. Across several southern states in 1871, hundreds of men were arrested in secret raids. Some cried, some fought, some begged. Many never thought this day would come. For the first time in American history, the federal government had launched a full prison strategy against a domestic terror group. But how did it get this far? To understand the crackdown, we have to go back. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the Union was broken. The South was destroyed. Slavery had ended. 4 million formerly enslaved people were now free. Freedom brought hope. Black men voted. Black children went to school. Black leaders were elected to office during Reconstruction. But not everyone accepted this new America. In 1866, a secret group formed in Tennessee. It called itself the Ku Klux Klan. At first, it claimed to be a social club, but it quickly became something darker. The Klan used fear as a weapon. Members wore white robes and masks. They rode horses at night. They burned homes. They beat teachers. They attacked black voters. They killed local officials who supported Reconstruction. Their goal was simple: restore white control, stop black political power, destroy federal reforms. They spread terror across states like South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and North Carolina. And local law enforcement often did nothing. Sometimes sheriffs were members of the Klan. Sometimes juries refused to convict. Victims had no protection. By 1870, violence had exploded. Black citizens were whipped for trying to vote. Republican leaders were assassinated. Entire communities lived in fear of nighttime raids. Congress began to receive reports, testimonies, letters describing brutal attacks. One report told of a man pulled from his bed and beaten until he could not walk. Another described a pregnant woman whipped because her husband voted Republican. The country faced a question: was this simply crime, or was it organized terrorism? President Ulysses S. Grant believed it was terrorism. Grant had led the Union Army during the Civil War. He had seen violence before. But what was happening in the South was different. It was secret, coordinated, political. Grant believed the federal government had a duty to act. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed a series of laws called the Enforcement Acts. One of them became known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. This law gave the president new powers. He could suspend habeas corpus in areas where terror was widespread. That meant suspected terrorists could be arrested and held without immediate release. He could use federal troops to protect citizens. And most importantly, federal courts could try crimes that states refused to punish. This was the beginning of America's first federal anti-terror prison strategy. In October 1871, President Grant made a bold move. He suspended habeas corpus in 9 counties in South Carolina. That meant mass arrests could begin immediately. Federal marshals moved fast. They arrested suspected Klansmen by the dozens, by the hundreds. Some were farmers, some were businessmen, some were local officials. All were accused of conspiracy to deprive citizens of their rights. The prisons began to fill. In York County, South Carolina, so many men were arrested that temporary holding facilities had to be created. Newspapers were shocked. Some called Grant a hero. Others said he was acting like a dictator. But for black families who had lived in fear, the arrests felt like protection. In court, federal prosecutors built their cases carefully. Witnesses testified about night rides, about whippings, about murders. Some former Klansmen turned against their own group to avoid long prison sentences. One by one, convictions came. Men who once terrorized their neighbors now stood in chains before federal judges. They were sentenced to prison terms in federal facilities. It was a powerful message. The United States government would no longer ignore organized terror. For a moment, it seemed to work. Violence in South Carolina dropped sharply in 1872. Klan activity decreased. Communities felt safer. But the crackdown came at a cost. Southern Democrats accused the federal government of abuse of power. Some Northern voters grew tired of Reconstruction. They asked, how long should troops remain in the South? And quietly, in some regions, old networks began to reorganize. Not always under the same name, but with the same goals. The first federal anti-terror prison strategy had proven something important. The government could arrest and imprison organized terror groups, but imprisonment alone could not erase hatred. As the 1870s moved forward, federal enforcement slowed. By 1877, Reconstruction officially ended. Federal troops withdrew from the South. Many protections for black citizens faded. Some of the men once arrested returned home, and new systems of racial control emerged. Yet the crackdown of 1871 left a lasting mark. It showed that the Constitution could be used to fight domestic terror. It created legal tools that future generations would study. It proved that organized violence against citizens was not just local crime. It was a national threat. But here is the question that still lingers. Did the federal crackdown truly defeat terror? Or did it simply push it into the shadows, waiting for another moment to rise? Because what happened next would test the limits of federal power even more. And it would reveal how fragile justice can be when politics changes.
In the next chapter, we will follow the courtroom battles, the prison sentences, and the shocking reversals that nearly erased the federal victory. The chains had been locked, but the story was far from over. The courtroom was silent. A former Klansman stood in front of a federal judge in South Carolina. Just months earlier, he had ridden at night with a hood over his face. Now he stood in chains, sweating under the eyes of the law. Witnesses had testified against him. They described whippings. They described threats. They described gunshots fired into the homes of black families. The judge lifted his voice and gave the sentence: prison. For the victim sitting in the back of the courtroom, it felt like justice had finally arrived. But outside that building, something dangerous was already growing, and it would soon threaten to undo everything the federal crackdown had achieved. After the mass arrests of 1871, grand juries were packed with testimony. Men who once believed they were untouchable now faced serious prison time. Some pleaded guilty, some confessed, some blamed others to save themselves. Federal prisons began holding men convicted under the Enforcement Acts. These were not ordinary criminals. They were members of a secret network that had used fear to control entire counties. For a short time, terror in places like York County and Spartanburg County sharply dropped. Night rides slowed, whippings decreased. Black voters felt brave enough to step back into polling stations. It seemed the strategy was working, but not everyone was pleased. Southern newspapers began calling the arrests tyranny. Political leaders claimed the federal government was punishing white citizens unfairly. They said Washington was interfering with state rights. The debate was loud and emotional. Was this justice, or was it federal overreach? President Ulysses S. Grant believed he had acted within the law. The Ku Klux Klan Act clearly gave him power to stop organized violence. Congress had approved it. The Constitution allowed the federal government to protect citizens when states refused. But politics is never simple. As trials continued into 1872 and 1873, defense lawyers began fighting back. They argued that the enforcement acts were unconstitutional. They claimed that criminal law belonged to the states, not the federal government. If the courts agreed, every conviction could collapse. Meanwhile, the country was facing new problems. In 1873, the Panic of 1873 hit the United States. Banks failed, businesses closed, railroads went bankrupt. Thousands of Americans lost jobs. The economy entered a deep depression. Suddenly, national attention shifted away from Southern terror. Northern voters who once strongly supported Reconstruction began to feel tired. They worried about money, not civil rights. They asked why federal troops were still in the South. Political support for the crackdown weakened. And then came a legal earthquake. In 1874 and 1875, key court decisions began limiting federal power. The most damaging blow would come from the Supreme Court itself. In 1876, the Supreme Court decided a case connected to the Colfax massacre in Louisiana. In that case, white supremacists had murdered dozens of black citizens who were defending a courthouse. Federal prosecutors had convicted several attackers under the Enforcement Acts, but the Supreme Court overturned those convictions. The court ruled that the federal government could not prosecute individuals for violating the rights of other citizens unless the state itself was involved. In simple terms, the decision made it much harder for the federal government to charge private terror groups. The ruling shook Reconstruction to its core. Suddenly, the legal tools used to imprison Klansmen became weaker. Defense attorneys across the South began filing appeals. Some convicted men were released. Others had sentences reduced. Inside prison walls, inmates who once feared long terms began to hope for freedom. For the victims, it felt like the ground was collapsing again. Imagine being a teacher who had been whipped by masked riders. Imagine finally seeing those attackers locked in prison. And then imagine hearing they might be released because of a legal technicality. Fear returned quietly, not always in loud attacks, but in whispers. By 1875, the original Ku Klux Klan organization had weakened. The name itself became less visible, but the beliefs did not disappear. Instead of one large centralized group, violence shifted into smaller local groups. Some called themselves rifle clubs. Others operated without formal names. The federal prison strategy had disrupted the network, but it had not destroyed the ideology. At the same time, political power in the South was changing. White Democrats regained control of many state governments. They called it redemption. They promised to restore local rule and remove federal influence. As Reconstruction governments fell, protections for black citizens faded. Federal troops were still present in some areas, but their numbers were shrinking. And then came 1877. The presidential election of 1876 was bitterly disputed. It ended with a political compromise. In exchange for resolving the election, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction officially ended. Without troops and without strong federal enforcement, the anti-terror prison strategy lost its power. Many of the men once arrested resumed leadership in their communities. Some returned to politics. Some joined local law enforcement. The message shifted. Instead of federal chains, local control returned.
But the story is not only about failure. The federal crackdown had created something new in American law. For the first time, the United States government had clearly declared organized racial violence to be a national crime. It had used federal prisons to send that message. Even though court rulings limited enforcement, the idea remained powerful. Future generations would look back at the Enforcement Acts as early anti-terror laws. Later civil rights movements would revive similar legal strategies. The battle between federal authority and local resistance would continue for decades. Inside prisons during the late 1870s, the remaining convicted Klansmen faced an uncertain future. Some served full terms, others were pardoned. President Grant himself faced political pressure. By the end of his presidency, his ability to push strong enforcement had weakened. And in many Southern communities, the calm that followed the crackdown was only temporary. New systems emerged. Instead of night riders in white robes, laws were passed that limited voting rights. Instead of open terror campaigns, discrimination became written into state codes. Prison also took on a new role. Through systems like convict leasing, many black men were arrested for minor offenses and forced into hard labor. While the federal crackdown had targeted white terror groups, local systems now used incarceration against black citizens. The weapon of prison shifted direction. The 1870s had begun with federal marshals kicking down doors to arrest Klansmen. They ended with a weakened Reconstruction and new forms of control taking root. So was the federal crackdown a victory? Yes and no. It proved that organized terror could be challenged by national law. It showed that the Constitution could protect citizens when states refused. But it also revealed how fragile justice can be when political will fades. Because laws are powerful only when people choose to enforce them. And as the 1880s approached, America would enter a long period where federal protection stepped back. Yet the story does not end in silence. The legal groundwork laid in the 1870s would be remembered. Decades later, during the Civil Rights Movement, lawmakers and judges would return to these same enforcement acts. They would revive them. They would strengthen them. They would use them again against terror groups. But before that revival, there was a long, painful period where federal prisons no longer stood as strong barriers against racial violence. And that raises one final, uncomfortable question. What happens when a government fights terror with full force and then slowly pulls back? In the next chapter, we will examine the human cost, the families affected, the prisoners released, and the chilling transformation of terror from open violence to silent control. Because sometimes the most dangerous change is not loud, it is quiet. The prison gates creaked open. A man stepped out into the sunlight in 1877. Just a few years earlier, he had been dragged from his home in chains during the great federal crackdown. He had stood in a courtroom accused of terror. He had worn the white robe. He had ridden at night. He had helped spread fear. Now he was free. No marching band waited, no crowd cheered, but something far more powerful welcomed him home. Silence. The federal troops were leaving the South. Reconstruction was ending. The promise of protection was fading. And across towns and counties, men like him were returning. What would they do next? That question hung heavy in the air. At first, there was no explosion of violence, no loud declarations, no dramatic midnight raids. Instead, something quieter began to grow. The 1870s had shown that the federal government could arrest and imprison members of organized terror groups. The enforcement acts had worked, at least for a time. Hundreds were arrested, many were convicted, some served real prison time. But when political support weakened, the power of those laws weakened too. After the Compromise of 1877, federal troops withdrew from southern states. Without soldiers to back them, federal marshals had less strength. Prosecutors felt pressure. Local governments shifted fully back into the hands of white Democratic leaders who had opposed Reconstruction.
The big, visible network of the Ku Klux Klan had been broken apart earlier in the decade. But the ideas behind it were not locked away in prison. They were carried home by the men who had served sentences. They were whispered at local meetings. They were written into new state laws. Instead of masked rioters burning homes, new methods appeared. Voting laws were changed. Rules became more complicated. Poll taxes and literacy tests would come later, but the groundwork was being laid. Instead of beating teachers at night, funding for black schools quietly disappeared. Instead of open terror campaigns, control became legal. It was less dramatic, but just as powerful. For black families who had once felt protected by federal arrests, the change was frightening. They remembered the midnight raids. They remembered the screams. They remembered the relief when federal troops arrived. Now they saw those troops leaving. Imagine being a child in 1877, watching blue uniforms march out of town. Your parents whisper that things may not stay safe. The crackdown had given hope. The retreat brought fear. Inside former federal prisons, records showed that some convicted Klansmen had served their full sentences. Others had been pardoned or released early due to legal appeals after Supreme Court rulings weakened federal power. The message was complicated. On one hand, the government had proven it could fight domestic terror. On the other hand, it had shown that political winds could change that fight. And politics was changing fast. Northern voters were tired of Reconstruction. The panic of 1873 had hurt families across the country. Jobs were scarce, money was tight. Many people began asking why federal resources were still being spent in the South. They did not always see the quiet fear returning there. So, attention moved on. But history did not stop. The federal crackdown of the 1870s became a lesson written in law books and court records. Lawmakers learned something important. If states refuse to protect citizens, the federal government can step in. That idea would sleep for decades. Then, in the 20th century, it would wake up again. During the Civil Rights Movement, federal prosecutors would use parts of those same enforcement acts to charge members of revived Ku Klux Klan groups. The legal tools created in the 1870s were still there. They had not disappeared. They had only been weakened. But before that revival, the late 19th century entered a long, painful period where federal prisons no longer stood as strong barriers against racial violence. And that raises one final, uncomfortable question. What happens when a government fights terror with full force and then slowly pulls back? In the next chapter, we will examine the human cost, the families affected, the prisoners released, and the chilling transformation of terror from open violence to silent control. Because sometimes the most dangerous change is not loud, it is quiet. The prison gates creaked open. A man stepped out into the sunlight in 1877. Just a few years earlier, he had been dragged from his home in chains during the Great Federal Crackdown. He had stood in a courtroom accused of terror. He had worn the white robe. He had ridden at night. He had helped spread fear. Now he was free. No marching band waited, no crowd cheered, but something far more powerful welcomed him home. Silence. The federal troops were leaving the South. Reconstruction was ending. The promise of protection was fading. And across towns and counties, men like him were returning. What would they do next? That question hung heavy in the air. At first, there was no explosion of violence, no loud declarations, no dramatic midnight raids. Instead, something quieter began to grow. The 1870s had shown that the federal government could arrest and imprison members of organized terror groups. The enforcement acts had worked, at least for a time. Hundreds were arrested, many were convicted, Some served real prison time. But when political support weakened, the power of those laws weakened too. After the Compromise of 1877, federal troops withdrew from southern states. Without soldiers to back them, federal marshals had less strength. Prosecutors felt pressure. Local governments shifted fully back into the hands of white Democratic leaders who had opposed Reconstruction.
The big visible network of the Ku Klux Klan had been broken apart earlier in the decade, but the ideas behind it were not locked away in prison. They were carried home by the men who had served sentences. They were whispered at local meetings. They were written into new state laws. Instead of masked riders burning homes, new methods appeared. Voting laws were changed. Rules became more complicated. Poll taxes and literacy tests would come later, but the groundwork was being laid. Instead of beating teachers at night, funding for black schools quietly disappeared. Instead of open terror campaigns, control became legal. It was less dramatic, but just as powerful. For black families who had once felt protected by federal arrests, the change was frightening. They remembered the midnight raids. They remembered the screams. They remembered the relief when federal troops arrived. Now they saw those troops leaving. Imagine being a child in 1877, watching blue uniforms march out of town. Your parents whisper that things may not stay safe. The crackdown had given hope. The retreat brought fear. Inside former federal prisons, records showed that some convicted Klansmen had served their full sentences. Others had been pardoned or released early due to legal appeals after Supreme Court rulings weakened federal power. The message to the South was complicated. On one hand, the government had proven it could fight domestic terror. On the other hand, it had shown that political wins could change that fight. And politics was changing fast. Northern voters were tired of Reconstruction. The panic of 1873 had hurt families across the country. Jobs were scarce. Money was tight. Many people began asking why federal resources were still being spent in the South. They did not always see the quiet fear returning there. So attention moved on, but history did not stop. The federal crackdown of the 1870s became a lesson written in law books and court records. Lawmakers learned something important. If states refuse to protect citizens, the federal government can step in. That idea would sleep for decades. Then, in the 20th century, it would wake up again. During the Civil Rights Movement, federal prosecutors would use parts of those same enforcement acts to charge members of revived Ku Klux Klan groups. The legal tools created in the 1870s were still there. They had not disappeared, they had only been weakened. But before that revival, the late 19th century entered a long, painful era. Without strong federal enforcement, Southern states passed laws that separated races. Over time, segregation became official policy. Violence did not vanish, it simply changed form. Lynchings would rise in the 1880s and 90s. Prison systems expanded, and a new structure of control emerged. Convict leasing became widespread. Black men were arrested for minor or false charges and leased to private companies for labor. Conditions were brutal. Mortality rates were high. In a painful twist, prison, once used by the federal government to protect black citizens from terror, became a tool used against them. The weapon had changed hands. The federal crackdown had shown the power of national action, but its retreat showed how quickly protection can fade. Still, we must not ignore what it achieved. In 1871, when President Ulysses S. Grant suspended habeas corpus in parts of South Carolina, it was a bold act. It sent a clear message.
Organized terror against citizens would not be tolerated. Hundreds were arrested. Fear shifted sides. For the first time, men who believed they were above the law felt the weight of federal chains. That mattered. It mattered to the families who slept peacefully for years. It mattered to the teachers who could stand in classrooms without hearing hooves in the night. It mattered to black voters who walked to polling stations under federal protection. Even if the protection did not last forever, it proved something powerful. The United States government could act, and that example would not be forgotten. The story of the federal crackdown on terror groups in the 1870s is not a simple story of victory or defeat. It is a story of courage and limits. It is a story of laws written with hope, enforced with strength, then weakened by politics. It is a story that shows how fragile justice can be when support fades. And it leaves us with a final question. When a nation faces organized terror, how long is it willing to stand firm? Because history shows that fighting terror is not just about arrests, it is about endurance. It is about whether protection continues when headlines fade. As the 1870s closed, America stepped away from Reconstruction. The federal prison strategy that once shook terror networks became quieter, but the memory remained. Court records, prison logs, congressional debates. They tell us that this was America's first true experiment with federal anti-terror enforcement. It was messy, it was controversial, it was imperfect, but it was real. And it set the stage for every future battle between national power and domestic extremism. The prison gates that opened in 1877 didn't simply release men, they released a warning.
Justice requires constant defense. If you found this story powerful, remember that history is not just about the past, it explains the present. Because the question of how a nation confronts terror has never truly gone away, and neither has the need for courage. The night was quiet again. No federal troops stood guard. No U.S. Marshals knocked on doors. The sound of boots on wooden porches had faded into memory. In a small southern town in 1878, a black family sat inside their home, listening to the wind. Years earlier, they had feared masked riders. Then they had felt relief when the federal crackdown began. They had watched men in white robes dragged away in chains. Now, the fear was different. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was slow, and it was settling in. The federal crackdown of the early 1870s had shown the full force of national power. President Ulysses S. Grant had suspended habeas corpus in parts of South Carolina. Hundreds of suspected Ku Klux Klan members had been arrested. Federal prisons had filled with men once thought untouchable. For a moment, it looked like the government had defeated domestic terror. But by the late 1870s, Reconstruction had ended. Federal troops had withdrawn. Supreme Court rulings had limited federal authority. Political energy had shifted toward economic problems and national elections, and terror had adapted. It did not always return with white robes and midnight rides. Instead, it entered courthouses, it entered state legislatures, it entered law books. In town after town, new leaders took office who had opposed Reconstruction from the beginning. They promised order and local control. They spoke calmly. They avoided open calls for violence, but their policies told a deeper story. Black voting power began to shrink. Jury service became harder to access. Local law enforcement changed hands. Protection that once came from Washington slowly disappeared. For many families, the change felt like watching a storm roll in without thunder. There was no single shocking attack that marked the end. Instead, there was a slow closing of doors. And prison, once used by the federal government to crush organized terror, took on a new meaning. Across the South,
Convict leasing expanded. Black men were arrested for small offenses, sometimes for vague charges like vagrancy. Once convicted, they were leased to private companies for labor in mines, farms, and railroads. Conditions were harsh. Oversight was weak. Abuse was common. The system created profit from imprisonment. This was not the same as the federal anti-terror strategy of 1871. That strategy aimed upward at organized groups spreading fear. This new system often aimed downward at the vulnerable. The contrast is powerful. In the early 1870s, federal law had reached into Southern communities to protect black citizens from terror. By the late 1870s, federal presence had faded, and local systems often used incarceration in ways that reinforced inequality. History can turn quickly, but it also leaves marks. The enforcement acts did not disappear. They remained part of federal law. Though weakened by court decisions, they still existed. Legal scholars studied them. Future lawmakers remembered them. When the 20th century brought new waves of violence from revived extremist groups, those old laws were revisited and strengthened. The idea that the federal government could step in against organized terror did not die in the 1870s. It was tested, it was bruised, but it survived. That is part of the legacy of the federal crackdown on terror groups. It was America's first large-scale attempt to treat domestic terrorism as a national crime rather than a local disturbance. It proved that the Constitution could be used to defend citizens when states failed. It also proved that enforcement requires more than one burst of action. It requires long-term commitment. As the decade closed, many Americans moved on. Newspapers wrote less about Klan trials. Political speeches shifted to other issues. Economic recovery became the focus. But in homes across the South, memories remained. Children who had seen federal troops march through their streets remembered that moment of protection. Former prisoners who had worn chains remembered that the federal government had come for them. Both sides understood something important. The power of national law could reach deep into local communities. Whether it stayed depended on the will of the people. And that is the heart of this story. The federal crackdown of the early 1870s was not perfect. Some convictions were overturned. Some sentences were shortened. Political compromise weakened its force. But it marked a turning point. Before it, organized racial terror operated almost freely in many areas. After it, even its supporters knew it could be challenged. That awareness changed the nation.
It planted the idea that domestic terror is not protected by tradition or local custom. It is a threat to the country itself. And when a country decides to act, it can. As the sun set on the 1870s, America stood at a crossroads. One path led toward stronger national protection of civil rights. The other led toward decades of segregation and silence. History shows which path was taken in the short term, but it also shows that the first path never fully disappeared. The federal crackdown on terror groups was the beginning of a long struggle between justice and resistance, a struggle that would rise again and again and again. The prison doors that slammed shut in 1871 echoed far beyond that decade. They echoed into future courtrooms, into future laws, into future battles over the meaning of freedom and safety. So when we look back at the 1870s, we do not just see arrests and trials. We see the first time the United States said clearly, organized terror against its own citizens is a national crime. That statement still matters today, and it began with midnight knocks, federal warrants, and the sound of chains in the dark. This is where our story ends, but the questions it raises never truly do. If this true story opened your eyes, there's much more history they never taught in school. Subscribe now so you never miss powerful real American crime stories like this. comment your thoughts. Was the federal crackdown enough? And get ready, because the next story will be even more shocking.